Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to crack open the black box of hiring and take a look at the secret life of your job application.
You know the feeling. We've all been there. You find what looks like the perfect job, you spend hours polishing your resume, you write a killer cover letter, and then you hit submit and send it off into the digital void. And then what? Crickets? What is actually happening on the other side of that screen? Where does your application go, and what secrets is it telling them about you?
So in this explainer, we're going to follow that journey. We'll start by looking into that black box, then see how companies decode your personal history, the gatekeeper tests you might face, the interview itself, and finally, we'll take a peek at the future of hiring, which is pretty much already here.
Okay, so you've clicked Submit. Your application is officially in the system. And now, the real analysis begins.
And it all starts with your paper trail. This is the very first impression a company gets of you long before they ever hear your voice.
And all of this information, your resume, your cover letter, the application form, it has an official name, biodata. The core idea is simple. The best predictor of what you'll do in the future is what you've done in the past. But as you're about to see, what actually counts as biodata can get surprisingly broad.
I mean, just look at the range of information we're talking about here. It goes from something you can easily check, like your college GPA, all the way to something completely subjective, like asking you to rate how adventurous you are. And then it can get really dicey, even crossing into legally questionable territory with invasive questions about your family. It's a real grab bag of data points.
So why are companies so obsessed with verifying all this data? Well, a big part of it comes down to this number. Around 32% of people, that's nearly a third, admit to lying on their resumes. It could be a tiny embellishment or a total fabrication, but this response distortion, as it's called, is a huge concern for employers. And this brings us to some really serious red flags in the process. Get this. One study found that a staggering 95% of application forms have at least one legally indefensible question. Other research shows that women who use traditionally masculine words in their cover letters can actually be penalized for it. And things like credit checks, they can trap people in what's been called a vicious downward spiral. That's why laws like the Fair Chance Act exist, to stop companies from asking about criminal records until after they've made a conditional job offer. So yeah, this first step is basically a minefield of potential bias. Okay, so let's say your paper trail makes the cut. Well, you might have to face the next hurdle, standardized tests designed to measure your integrity and personality.
Now, these tests usually come in two main flavors. You've got your overt honesty tests, which are super direct. They'll ask stuff like, do you believe most people steal from their company? Then you have the more subtle, personality-based tests. They don't ask about stealing directly, but instead they'll try to measure broader traits like how conscientious you are, to predict if you might be a problem employee.
So, the million-dollar question, do these things actually work? Well, it's complicated. You've got a major meta-analysis from 1993 that found they're pretty decent predictors with a validity of 0.41. But then, a more recent analysis from 2012 came to a very different conclusion, finding a much lower validity of just 0.12. This contrast pretty much perfectly captures the ongoing scientific debate about how useful these tests really are. You're probably wondering, why not just use an actual lie detector? Great question. The answer is simple. A federal law passed back in 1988. The Employee Polygraph Protection Act basically banned lie detectors for most pre-employment screenings, which is a big reason these written honesty tests became so popular in the first place. You've made it through the paper trail. You've passed the tests. Now comes the most critical and definitely the most human stage of them all, the interview.
And right here, the single most important factor is structure. An unstructured interview, basically a casual chat where the questions are made up on the fly, has shockingly low validity. But a structured interview, where every single candidate gets asked the same set of job-related questions, it is dramatically more effective at predicting who will succeed. Not only that, but it also reduces bias and is way easier to defend in court.
So why is structure so important? Well, because without it, our brains just take shortcuts. And this quote from a famous set of studies says it all. Interviewers pretty much make up their minds in the first 4 minutes. The rest of the interview is often just them looking for evidence to prove their initial gut feeling was right.
And those first 4 minutes are just packed with hidden biases. A single negative detail, it can sink your chances 90% of the time. That's confirmatory bias at work. Then there's the contrast effect. If you interview right after 3 duds, you're going to look like a superstar, and vice versa. And of course, we all have these subconscious prototypes of what a good employee looks like, which are often loaded with stereotypes.
So what do good structured questions actually look like? Well, they tend to fall into two main camps. You have situational questions, which are about the future. They ask, what would you do in a hypothetical work scenario? And then you have experience-based questions, which are about the past. They ask, tell me about a time when you did something. Both force you to give concrete examples, not just vague chit-chat.
And that brings us to our final section. Because all of these core ideas we've talked about still matter, but technology is completely reshaping how they're being applied. So, welcome to the modern hiring toolbox. An unbelievable 93% of recruiters now use social media to check out candidates. Artificial intelligence is parsing your resume before a human being ever lays eyes on it. You might be asked to do an interviewerless video interview, where you're just recording answers to questions on a screen. And companies are even using game-based assessments and virtual reality to simulate the job.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway here? For job seekers, it means your digital footprint is now basically part of your resume. You've got to be ready for those highly specific, structured questions, whether they come from a person or a computer. And for employers, the lesson is the same as it's always been. Structure is your best defense against bias and bad hires. And if you're going to use all this new tech, you have to do it ethically and transparently.
And that leaves us with the final critical question. We have more data, more tools, and more intelligent algorithms than we've ever had before. But as the hiring process gets smarter, is it also getting any fairer? Or are we just hiding all our old biases inside new, more complicated black boxes? That is the challenge for the future of hiring. Thanks for joining this explainer.